Good morning, good morning, good morning. All right, here we go, folks. We are going to start right here. And take a look at this. All right, so we're going to start out with a little Quizlet Live today. After that, we are going to get right into a crash course in which I am going to I'm going to go through that with you, okay? Because that's some pretty some of that stuff might go right over your head, and that is more than okay. But we're going to complete that sheet together. You're going to make sure that you download Flipgrid today. So when so typically, you know how we take a quiz at the end of the hour and I'll cut you loose if you don't have any issues. Please stick around if you're having issues downloading Flipgrid. Now, I know that about 3/4 of you already have Flipgrid downloaded and you're good to go. Okay, because a majority, well, I think it's a majority of this class that I've had before, or you probably just have it from another class. But anywho, let's make sure that we get that today. What do you, here's the big target for today, though, folks, is what do you wonder about the American Revolution? What are you interested in? Because that's what I want you to start thinking about. I want you to think this weekend about what you would like to do a personalized learning topic about the American Revolution. This could be anything you're interested in. If you're really interested in, I don't know, drumming in the band, and you take a look at the way in which soldiers would march and they'd have a drummer, and you have an interesting question pertaining to that, I would love it if you researched a question, an open-ended question of your choosing, and came to a conclusion about that question. Okay, maybe some of you are more interested in a military topic. Maybe some of you are more interested in something dealing with art, whatever it might be. I want you to ask a question about the American Revolution, research that thing, and then come up with a conclusion that you are going to give to me on Flipgrid. But today, all we're going to be doing is formulating the question, because the question is probably one of the most important parts of that research. Okay. Then lastly, we'll take that American Revolution quiz. Any questions about what we're doing here today, folks? This shouldn't go overly long today. Probably about 25 minutes, 30, something like that. We good? All right, folks, I want you to go to Quizlet.live. Quizlet.live, please. Put the code up there in just a second, my dids. Whoops. Whoops. There we go. Okay, just about 30 more seconds for everybody to get in so we can do this. We're going to play 3 rounds, and then we'll get right into Crash Course, my dudes. All right, here we go. There are your spirit animals, folks. And there, we lost Emily. Oh, she's back in, and they're racing. Oh, we got a lot of contenders this time. We're past the halfway point. It could be anybody's race right now. Dolphins, Stingrays, and T-Rex is all in it. Puma's making a late push. Oh, Chameleons, Wolves still there. Lions, Puffins, Bison. Oh, Orca's making a late move. Oh, coming around the home stretch. Dolphins. Oh, Stingrays got up. Oh, nail biter. Oh, and it's Dolphins by a dorsal fin. Here we go. Round two, and they're racing. Oh, Dolphins out to a dominating lead again. Lions, Rhinos, and Orcas making a late push here. Oh, we got 4 or 5 possible contenders. Oh, it's Rhinos and Dolphins coming in the final stretch of the race. Oh, McKenna doesn't want to let anybody else play today. Here we go. Last round. This one's for all the Tostitos, folks. And they're racing. Oh, everybody comes cleanly out of the gate. I like it. Just about at the midway point here. Rhinos and Puffins trying to dethrone the Dolphins. Oh, man. It's a nail biter. Oh, Puffins, what happened? Boogers. Wowie, that is one dominating performance. Nice work. All right, here we go. We're going to be done with Quizlet Live for now. Here's what I want you to do, though, folks. I'm going to need to share my screen again. Hold on one sec. Okay, back to it here. I want you to go into Schoolio, and you're going to open up that Revolutionary War folder. So it's going to look a little something like this. It's a pink folder and it's titled Crash Course American Revolution. And you're going to find a PDF and drop that bad boy into Notability. Okay, put that into Notability right now. And then as you're doing that, I am going to get this set up. Okay, and I have got to get all of this.
world history, and today you aren't going
Or can you?
You're muted.
One sec. Okay, so now I'm back on. I am presenting, so everybody can see this, yes? Can everybody hear me?
Yes.
Sorry about that. All right, here we go.
going to get a blow-by-blow chronology of the American Revolution, and you aren't going to get cool biographical details about Thomas Jefferson or George Washington, but you are going to get me not wearing any pants. Mr. Green, did you know that George Washington might have had slave teeth implanted into his jaw? Yeah, I did, me from the past. And while it's fun to focus on metaphorically resonant details, what we're concerned with here is why the American Revolution happened and the extent to which it was actually revolutionary. Plus, for the first time in Crash Course history, I have a legitimate chance of getting through an entire episode without butchering a single pronunciation. Unfortunately, next week we will be in France, and je parle français comme un idiot. So intellectual historians might put the roots of the American Revolution earlier, but I'm going to start with the end of the 7 Years' War in 1763, which, as you will recall from last week, was one, expensive, and two, a victory for the British, including British subjects living in America who now had more land and therefore more money. Right, so in 1765, the British government was like, hey, since we went into this debt to get you all this new land, we trust that you won't mind if we pass the Stamp Act, in which we place a fancy stamp on your documents, newspapers, playing cards, etc., and in return, you give us money. Well, it turns out the colonists weren't so keen on this, not so much because the tax was high, but because they had no direct representation in the parliament that had levied the tax. And plus, they were cranky about the crown keeping large numbers of British troops in the colonies even after the end of the 7 Years' War. And then the British government was like, you are inadequately grateful, and the colonists were like, shut up, we hate you. And the British government was like, as long as you live under our roof, you live by our rules, and so on. But eventually, the British backed down and repealed the Stamp Act. The repeal inspired a line of commemorative teapots, thereby beginning America's storied tradition of worthless collectible ceramics. But in the end, this only emboldened the colonists when the British tried to put new taxes on the Americans in the form of the Townshend Act.
There you go, Townshend Act. You can see how it's spelled right there. That's number one. That's number one. Okay, now we're on to number two. These led to further protests and boycotts, and more importantly, more blank among the colonists. More blank among the colonists.
These led to further protests and boycotts, and most importantly, more organization.
More organization among the colonists. Organization.
Among the colonists. The protests escalated. 1770 saw the Boston Massacre, which with its sum total of 5 dead was perhaps the least massacre of all time. And in 1773, a bunch of colonists dumped about $1 million worth of tea into Boston Harbor in protest of British government decisions that actually would have made British tea cheaper. Oh, it's time for the open letter? Oh, that did not go well. An open letter to tea. But first, let's see what's in the secret compartment today. Oh. It's a gigantic tea bag. Let's see what flavor it is. Bitter tyranny variety. Dear Tea, like all Americans who love justice and freedom, I hate you. But I understand you're quite popular in the UK, where the East India Company would periodically go to war for you. But what fascinates me about you, Tea, I mean, aside from the fact that people choose to drink you when there are great American refreshments available like Mountain Dew, is that even though you're stereotypically English, you're not English. It's Chinese or Burmese or Indian, no one really knows, but it's definitely not English. You didn't even have tea until like the 1660s. Posers. Best wishes, John Green.
In your world history classes, you definitely will talk about cultural diffusion. And that is a beautiful example of cultural diffusion. Tea isn't English, but for whatever reason, due to their colonies, they had colonies all about the world, and they had access to this tea. And I think we talked about this before, about how they had this influx of tea. They brought it to the Americas thinking that the colonists would like it and it would be cheaper. but it was choice that really made them mad. So here we go. We're on number 3. As previously noted, the blank blank benefited tremendously from the blank of consumer goods in the American colonies.
So the Boston Tea Party led to further British crackdowns, and then mobilization of colonial militias, and then Paul Revere, and then actual war. But you can hear all about that stuff on like TV miniseries. I want to focus on one of the ways that colonists protested unfair taxation. Let's go to the thought bubble. As previously noted, the English crown benefited.
The English crown benefited tremendously from the import of consumer goods to the American colonies. They benefited on the import of consumer goods to the American colonies.
Tremendously from the import of consumer goods to the American colonies. And one of the most effective ways American colonists could protest taxation without representation was by boycotting British products.
Taxation without representation was by boycotting British products. And taxation without representation was by boycotting British products. So we're good on number 3. We're on to number 4. In order to enforce these boycotts, the protesters created blank of blank.
In order to enforce these boycotts, the protesters created committees of correspondence, which spread information about who was and...
Committees of correspondence. Committees of correspondence. Let me rewind just a sec there so you can see that.
In order to enforce these
committees of correspondence, which spread information about who was and who was not observing the boycotts. Now, what's kind of interesting about this, folks, is that you witnessed one of the largest, and I don't care where you lie on a political spectrum on this issue, you have to argue that the Black Lives Matter protest was one of the biggest social movements that this country and cultural movements that this country's ever seen, in terms of at least numbers involved in the movement. Imagine if there was a group going around trying to enforce who was or who was not actively either boycotting or being a part of the movement. And that's what the Committees of Correspondence is a group that went around ensuring who was and who was not participating in the boycott. So it was like protest, but at the same time, it was like a group going around making sure that you are participating in the boycott, which I think is kind of interesting. So here we go. Number 5, the Maryland Committee of Correspondence, in fact, was instrumental in setting up the blank, 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 which convened to coordinate a response to the fighting that started in 1775.
The protesters created committees of correspondence, which spread information about who was and was not observing the boycotts, and these committees also could coerce non-compliers into compliance, which is to say that they were creating and enforcing policy, kind of like a government does. The Maryland Committee of Correspondence, in fact, was instrumental in setting up the First Continental Congress.
First Continental Congress. First Continental Congress, which convened to coordinate a response to the fighting that started in 1775.
Which convened to coordinate a response to the fighting that started in 1775. This was back when Congresses did things, by the way. It was awesome. Anyway, the Continental Congress is most famous for drafting and approving the Declaration of Independence.
DOI, Declaration of Independence, number 6. The Declaration of Independence. The Continental Congress is most famous for drafting and approving the Declaration of Independence. That's number 6. We are on to number 7.
No, thought bubble. That's the Will Smith vehicle, Independence Day. I mean the Declaration of Independence, right? That one. It's not your fault. You guys are Canadian. You've never declared independence. Worth noting, by the way, that the Congress edited out more than a quarter of Jefferson's original declaration, and he forever after insisted that they'd, quote, mangled it. Anyway, I would argue the heavy lifting of the American Revolution was already done by the Declaration. In truth, by the time the shooting started, most of the colonists were already self-governing.
Should be 2 blanks there. Self-governing. Self-governing. I guess when we have a hyphen, we go 1 blank. Makes sense. In truth, by the time the shooting started, most of the colonists were already self-governing and had developed a sense of themselves as being something separate and different from Great Britain. Self-governing, separate, different.
and had developed a sense of themselves as something separate and different from Great Britain, as evidenced by these committees of correspondence, which functioned as shadow governments, eventually reaching out to foreign governments, establishing an espionage network, tarring and feathering loyalists and royal officials, which, by the way, is incredibly painful and dangerous to the victim, and even
tarring and feathering. We haven't talked at all about that. Maybe that'd be a good question for you to take a look at when we get into your personalized learning. Okay, that was a pretty violent deal. Hot tar poured on your body, and then feathers on top of it. Yeesh.
Recruiting physicians to tell American men that drinking British tea would make them weak and effeminate. Thanks, Thought Bubble. Now, despite all this, about 20% of colonists remained loyal.
20% of colonists remained loyal to Great Britain throughout the war, especially in major cities that Britain occupied. They were referred to as loyalists or Tories. You hear them referred to as both ways, loyalists or Tories. About 20% of colonists, number 8.
To Great Britain throughout the war, especially in the major cities that Britain occupied. Also, lots of slaves continued to support the British, especially after Britain promised that any slaves who fought with them would be freed.
Number 9, slaves continued to support the British, especially after Britain promised that any slaves that fought with them would be freed. Would be freed. Interesting. Okay, so why did slaves fight for the British? Because they promised they would be freed. Any questions about the first page whatsoever? Any that you missed? We're on to the second page. Here we go, number 10. Here's what's pretty revolutionary about the American Revolution. The colonists threw off the rule of a blank blank and replaced it with a government that didn't have a blank. A radical idea. Here we go.
And it's worth noting that while we generally celebrate the revolution and see it as a step toward justice and equality, the people who most needed the protection of a government might have been better off and more free if Britain had won, especially since Britain ended slavery well before America did, and, without a civil war. Also, even though most Americans had come to see themselves as separate from Britain before 1776, the British certainly didn't see it that way. They continued to fight either until 1781 or 1783, depending on whether you calculate by when they actually gave up or when the peace treaty was signed. So you can't really say the American Revolution was won before the fighting even started, but the truth is the American Revolution and the war for independence weren't like this. They were like this. So here's what was pretty revolutionary about the American Revolution. The colonists threw off the rule of an imperial monarchy.
Imperial monarchy, you see it spelled there. The rule of an imperial monarchy, and replaced it with a government that didn't have a king. Now, a lot of you that know your world history might look at that and go, well, we've had revolutions like that. Like, look at the French Revolution. But, it didn't necessarily end that way. We ended up with Napoleon after the French Revolution, okay? So quite often when you have these revolutions, it's replaced by another monarch or it's replaced by a dictator. What's interesting about this is they threw off the rule of an imperial monarch and replaced it with a government that didn't have a king. Even though, as you learned in U.S. History A, they tried to offer Washington a crown, but he turned it down.
And replaced it with a government that didn't have a king, a radical idea in a world that didn't feature many non-monarchical forms of government. And if you look at the explanations for the revolution, especially those contained in the Declaration of Independence and in pamphlets like Thomas Paine's Common Sense.
Thomas Paine's Common Sense, number 11. Thomas Paine's Common Sense, the most popular pamphlet in the world at that time. Okay. Common sense. There's definitely a revolutionary zeal that's informed by let's see what it is.
There's definitely a revolutionary zeal that's informed by the Enlightenment.
The Enlightenment. The Enlightenment. You're going to see a lot of movements going on about the time of the American Revolution, and that's not a coincidence, okay? You've got the Enlightenment, you've got the Scientific Revolution, you've got the Renaissance all going on at the same time, okay? All kind of spearheaded by, I would argue, the Enlightenment, okay? So the blank of blank gave the government no power to tax. Let's see, here we go. We're on to number 12.
And that's especially true if you focus on the idea of liberty, as many of the pamphleteers did. That said, if you look at the actual outcome of the revolution, aside from the whole no king thing, it wasn't that revolutionary. Let's look, for instance, at two ideas central to the revolution: property rights and equality. So the Articles of Confederation gave
So the Articles of Confederation, number 12, you remember that from U.S. History A, that we started out with the Articles of Confederation, which was a loose confederation of those states together. Okay, so we're good with number 12.
Gave the government no power to tax, which had the effect of making sure that people who had property were able to keep it because they never had to pay the government anything in exchange for the right to own and use it. And that's very different from taxation systems dating all the way back to like Mesopotamia and ancient Egypt. And it's probably not a coincidence that most of the writers and signers of the Declaration of Independence were men of property. And they wanted to keep it that way. So basically, the white guys who controlled the land and its production before the American Revolution were the same white guys who controlled it after the American Revolution. And this leads us to the second and more important way that as a revolution, the American one falls a bit short. So if you've ever studied American history, you're probably familiar with the greatest line in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Sorry, ladies. And you also may know that at the time those words were written, a large segment of the American population, perhaps as much as 30%, were slaves of African descent who were held as property and were definitely 100% not treated as equal to whites.
And that's the glowing double standard of the American Revolution, and we'll talk more about this as we go forward. But that would be an awesome question. How did they not, see the glaring double standard? How could you state that all men are created equal and then, not include a large majority of the population?
In fact, the guy who wrote those words held slaves and was fighting against a government who promised to free any slaves who supported it. Furthermore, women couldn't vote, and neither could white men who didn't own enough property, meaning that the government of, for, and by the people was in fact of, for, and by about 10 to 15% of the people. But here's the real question. Was the American Revolution what the historian Jonathan Israel called a revolution of mind? Did it change the way we think about what people are and how we should organize ourselves? Addressing those questions will involve a brief foray into the history of ideas. Let's study the Enlightenment.
Number 13. The Enlightenment was primarily a celebration of humans' ability to understand and improve the world through reason. The Enlightenment, number 13, was primarily a celebration of humans' ability to understand and improve the world through reason.
Enlightenment was primarily a celebration of humans' ability to understand and improve the natural world through reason. The Enlightenment had a number of antecedents.
Antecedents. Something that happens before and not necessarily a cause. Okay, so that's why we don't use the word cause there. Okay, antecedents, including the blank blank and the blank blank. Okay, I think we talked before about the scientific revolution and the European Renaissance, and that's what we're looking for here. I can't remember the order, so let's see where it goes. Here we go. Number 14. The Enlightenment had a number of antecedents, including the scientific revolution and the European the European Renaissance.
Including the European Renaissance and the scientific revolution.
Got them backwards, but oh well.
But what made it special was that some of its more radical proponents, like Immanuel Kant, for instance, went so far as to argue that human reason rendered a belief in God unnecessary and, by extension, proclaimed that any belief in divine intervention or a divine plan for humanity was just superstition. Given that this was coming out of an overwhelmingly Christian Europe, this was a pretty controversial suggestion, and not all Enlightenment thinkers would go that far. And more moderate Enlightenment thinkers were also more willing to countenance hierarchical social and political structures. Like John Locke, a major Enlightenment thinker, formulated his version of inalienable rights as life, liberty, and property.
John Locke. Did you guys see how they spelled that? It's L-O-C-K-E. He spells John the wrong way, J-O-H-N. And then Locke, L-O-C-K-E. You guys see that? Sorry, I didn't pause it.
Political structures. Like John Locke, a major Enlightenment thinker, formulated his version of inalienable rights as life, liberty, and property. And that's much more traditional than arguing, for instance, that property should be held communally. And it's no coincidence that the more moderate Enlightenment thinkers, like Locke and Adam Smith, happen to be British, and the real radicals were French. And the founders of the United States were far more closely linked to those British Enlightenment thinkers than to the French, who influenced the French Revolution, which, as we will see next week, goes swimmingly. But even if the government that America's revolutionaries came up with didn't overturn privilege or tear apart the social order as the French Revolution tried to do, it did make significant changes. America made sure that there would never be a formal nobility, except for the Count of Chocula, and it recognized the equal rights of daughters and widows when
there would never be a formal nobility. And It recognized the equal rights of daughters and widows. Interesting. Okay, so if nobody's noble, that means that everybody's on the same playing field. Okay, so that's number 16. Okay, 17. But the real seismic change was that after the revolution, Americans came to view themselves as blank to each other.
When it came to inheriting and possessing property, also it created a world in which future countesses could rehabilitate their reputations in New York. But the real seismic change was that after the revolution, Americans came to view themselves as equal to each other.
Equal to each other.
And in the context of the 18th century, that was pretty radical. Ordinary Americans came to believe that no one in a basic down-to-earth and day in and day out manner was really better than anyone else. That was equality as no other nation had ever quite had it. And in the end, the ideas of the American Revolution, ideas about property and equality and representation are...
Property, equality, and representation. Property, equality, and representation.
Had it. And in the end, the ideas of the American Revolution, ideas about property and equality and representation, are still hugely important in shaping political discourse around the world, and particularly in America. And by America, I mean the United States. I'm sorry, Canadians and Mexicans and Central Americans and South Americans. We're provincial, okay? I mean, here in the United States, our presidential candidates must both know how to wear a suit and how to bowl. But the American Revolution also reminds us, as the French one will next week, that revolutionary ideas and values are not always easy to live up to. Nothing challenges one's belief in equality quite like becoming rich and powerful. Indeed, rare is the revolutionary who doesn't become on some level like Orwell's pigs, insisting that while all animals were created equal, some were created more equal than others. In short, if you're going to base your new society on philosophy, you should try to found it on ideals that are as inclusive and humanistic as possible, because the people executing those ideas will never be ideal.
All right. Any questions off the second page here, folks? Any you missed?
The second part of number 14.
The Enlightenment had a number of antecedents, including the Scientific Revolution and the European Renaissance. Any other questions? Anything that you missed whatsoever? I can hear some of you turning that in right now. That is awesome. As you are turning that in, here's what I'm going to show you here, folks. We are under the Revolutionary War folder here, okay? And I want everybody to open up the personalized topics deal that I am showing you right here. Personalized topics, okay? I don't know why you can see both of those. That's weird. I'll have to fix that. You guys are in first hour. I hope that you can see that, okay? This is first hour. Okay, so under first hour, I'm going to close my email so you guys stop hearing that, okay? What do you wonder, okay? I want you to open up that Google document right now. That's third hour, okay? But it's going to look a little something like this. What is your last name? What is your first name? What do you wonder about the American Revolution? Now set that off to the side, okay? Because I am going to open up this document right here, titled Possible Topics. Now, these are all possible topics that you could be looking at for the American Revolution. Now, does that mean that you are confined to these topics? Absolutely not. I would love it for you to come up with your own question. But here is what you have to do. Here is what you have to do. And guys, a bulk of your points are actually going to come with how you phrase your question. So this is important. Your question has to be open-ended. Let me say that again. Your question has to be open-ended. Okay. Well, what does that mean? Well, let's talk about a close-ended question first. A close-ended question means that there's a...
Or it's something simple to answer like, what was the date of the Declaration of Independence?
You're on mute.
Good governor, how long have I been on mute? Have I been on mute this entire time?
For a while.
You got to give me something here. Wow, how long have I been on mute? How long did you guys hear anything about these topics?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Did you hear anything about how to phrase a question?
No.
A little.
Okay.
A
I
tad.
don't understand how I became muted, but sorry about that. So what's most important here, folks, is that you have to make up your question. Okay. You have to make up a question that is open-ended. That's open-ended. And what the heck does that mean? It means that it's a topic, okay, or excuse me, it's a question in which there is like a shade of gray to the answer. It can't be a close-ended question that in which there's just a yes or no answer. Okay, so like, what is the date of the Declaration of Independence? That's no good, okay, because it's close-ended. It's a yes or no answer. It's not a complex answer, okay? I've phrased some of these as questions, but I put others just as topics. So if you're interested in like a military topic, here you go. Okay, here are some examples of those. Okay, but like I said, you're not confined to these questions. Okay. I've listed some political topics on there, some of which, you know, you can really delve into some interesting stuff. If you're interested in music, you know, why was Yankee Doodle such a popular song in the time period? Why, when the British surrendered at Yorktown, they sang the song "The World Turned Upside Down." Was that deliberate? You know, what was that about? Okay. We've got some pieces of art during this time period. Washington crossing the Delaware, the surrender of Lord Cornwallis, all of that stuff are examples of, you could critique the art. You could ask something specifically about the painting. Okay. Loyalists and Tories, what happened to them after the war? That's kind of a close-ended question itself, but you could make it a little more open-ended. Okay, so a lot of these questions you're going to need to kind of work on as we go along. Okay, and that's why I'm having you fill out this Google form by Friday. I want to give you feedback on that Google form. Okay, so what's something you genuinely wonder about? What's something you genuinely wonder about the American Revolution? Okay, you want to make sure that you make that question open-ended so that you have an easier time researching it next week. Okay. And then I want you to make three hypothetical questions that you're going to put into that Google form. And that is due by Friday. That is due by tomorrow, because I want to be able to help you. I want to be able to guide you when it comes to those questions. So if you submit a close-ended question, at least I can give you some feedback. Or if you are completely clueless, and you don't know where to go with this, and you can at least give me like, hey, I'm interested in XYZ, I'm interested in this, how can I make a question out of that? I can give you some feedback with that, okay? Any questions about what I want you to do with these personalized topics here? We're good? All right. Well, here's what we got here, folks. Okay. I am going to open up that term quiz right now. Okay. Assuming that you either don't have any questions, or excuse me, go on and take the quiz. As soon as you're done with the quiz, you can be done for the day. If you have any questions about the personalized topics, stick around. If you have any questions about anything else, stick around. Okay, but I'm going to open up that quiz right now. So like I said, I want you to stick around as you're taking the quiz, because sometimes people get kicked out and it's just easier for me to take care of it while you're here. Have at it. The quiz is available.
I took the quizzy last night. I thought it was due on Wednesday.
Yep.
Am I like good to go then?
Yep, you can go.
Okay.
Anybody else having problems with their quiz?